Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Vishal Dahiya, and this week we will discuss the issue of Space Force being announced by the United States. Aiming to ensure the American supremacy in space and reclaim the leadership position, United States President Donald Trump recently announced the creation of a new Space Force. This follows decades of discussion on a separate space branch in the American military setup. The United States military activity in space dates back to the space age, which began with the launch of Sputnik by Soviet Union in late 1950s, and since then has seen a lot of developments. In 1982, Air Force Space Command was established, whose work involves Earth surveillance, communications, command and control of ground-based weapons and satellite security. So the question being asked right now is, what is the need for a separate but equal Space Force, and what will it do which is not being done by the existing unit of the US Air Force? Trump's announcement has also reopened the debate about the need to manage military space activities and follow the guidelines laid down under the international law on this matter. For more on this, we are joined by a distinguished panel of guests. Let me start by introducing them to you, beginning with Mr. Sheel Sharma, former diplomat, who is with us. Then we have with us retired Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur, ADG of Center for Air Power Studies. And we also have with us Pant, Head of the Strategic Studies from ORF. Welcome all of you to Rajya Sabha TV studios. And let me begin with you, Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur, to try and understand what is this concept of the Space Force. It is something which is not new. It has been talked about earlier as well. But if you could explain it for our viewers as well, what does it mean when we talk about having a separate branch like the Space Force, which the US President is announcing?
Ever since the Sputnik was launched and the space race started, there has always been a conflict. Who will control space, not only amongst the countries, but within each country, the three services and other branches of the government. Traditionally, it's been a part of the Air Force of that country. So the space affairs were looked after by the United States Air Force. But in the 90s, there was a space commission that was set up because there were other claimants to controlling space. And in that, it was said that though the space would not be part of, is not the property, shall I use the word property, of the United States Air Force, but the USAF will control it. Now what's happened is that the space affairs have been divested from the United States Air Force, and a special sixth force is what the the media says will be formed, which implies that it will have its own budget, it will have its own personnel, its own infrastructure, and it will have its own aims and will not be subservient to what is decided by the United States Air Force.
Okay.
It has long-term ramifications in that the budgeting would increase, the expertise would increase, and since the approach will be more focused towards space affairs, which is required by every country, that much more emphasis would be laid on the plans, on the military plans. They would also be able to control space, control the activities of their adversaries in space, and shall I say, it's a bigger threat now.
Okay, it's a bigger threat. Let me bring in Pant on this here. Do you agree with what Air Vice Marshal is saying here, that this will bring in more focused approach as far as the United States space branch is concerned, but there already exists a sub-branch in the United States Air Force. The question which is being asked domestically there in the United States is, and elsewhere in Europe also, what is the need to create a separate sixth branch?
Yes, and I think the question is being asked, is being framed because the concerns about budget, the concerns about personnel allocation, the concerns about resource allocation, the concern about, ultimately a country has a limited pot of resources. So how do you allocate those resources most effectively is the challenge that every country faces. So in this case, Mr. Trump is announcing something that has been deliberated upon for quite some time now in the American strategic community. The question has always been, how do you best look after space assets and their use? And in that context, the argument that has come that adding another layer of bureaucracy perhaps will be one of the consequences of having another separate space force, and that can create additional complexities. One should remember that just a year back or so, the Defense Secretary Jim Mattis himself said that no, there's no need for it at this point. There has been the Air Force Secretary who has said that we will be adding another layer of bureaucracy if we want efficient and effective implementation of national security policy. Then it does not really make any sense to add another layer of bureaucracy at this level. But I think the question is, the broader question that America has been debating quite some time with itself is whether having a separate space force allows, as the Vice Marshal said, allows America to focus on space, because the sense is that somehow America is losing out the space race. And this is ironical because if you look at this point, the raw data, the number of satellites and the kind of money that they are spending, America still leagues ahead of other countries. But I think the sense that many in America have at this point is that the Russians and the Chinese are catching up, and therefore if something dramatic is not done at this juncture, then perhaps it will be too late for America to think about space being at the final frontier for them.
Okay, let's bring in Ambassador Sharma here. Ambassador Sharma, how do you look at it in terms of the way it has been projected by the Americans, and as Harsh was also pointing out, the way it is being seen by the other nations, because it is not the Cold War era, so as to say, when the entire space age began.
As Harsh said, this has been in the air for quite some time. This whole space command. There was the Air Space Command which George Bush set up. Then Obama also continued with that. Then some time back, at the Belfer Center, there was a big paper by Ashton Carter, who was the Defense Secretary in Obama's time. And they all have been emphasizing that you need to focus on space, because space is an integral part of their strategic forces. Today, strategic forces do not just comprise nuclear bombs and missiles and bombers, but they also include cyberspace, they include space. Space-based assets like, these satellites, plus in the geostationary orbit, how you observe the surveillance. There is something called space situation awareness, which means you must track what is there in space. So the US ability to track, observe, and also to be able to help, like in the case of removal of debris, there is now capability being developed, and is already there, to take care of the debris. Recently, there was the Chinese space ship called Tiangong-1. It was collapsing. It had stopped communication, and it was falling from the orbit. But apart from the US and to an extent China, nobody knew where it will drop and when it will drop. But the US has infrared sensors in the deeper space. So this whole idea of taking control of space, because of its implications for, on the one hand, for the strategic forces, on the other, for civilian applications also, on the user side, everyone, like if you talk about the different force commands, each of them are actually on the user side using the space-based assets, satellites and communication, for surveillance, for weather forecast, for the whole range of activity in the civilian side. And then you have space-based guidance of your missiles. Then you talk about these very high velocity, 10 Mach kind of missiles which they have developed, which are conventional in nature, but which can strike like a bolt from the blue. For all of them, space-based assets are required. So it was inevitable that the US would take hold of this, just as it has taken hold of their various commands which look after the various strategic assets. So space is actually today, space domain is a strategic asset, and to control it, to manage it, to steer it to the best use, this is required. This is in sync with their nuclear posture review, which they issued in January.
So this is just going one step further. But Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur, I would like to bring in you here and see, if you look at there are twin uses when we talk about utilization of technology in the outer space. One is, as Mr. Sharma was pointing out, the civilian use. The other is military use, to try and be able to go ahead and strike at your enemies, or try and protect your own satellites or launch preemptive strikes as well. If you look at it in those terms, does it look like that the military use of the technology in outer space has outweighed the civilian use, or is about to outweigh, given the kind of line and postures which are being taken by superpowers like United States?
No, both coexist. It's plain and simple. Earlier, it was the sanctuary regime. It was a sanctuary. It was a peaceful area. Anybody could go and operate there. But now it's the control regime, which is you are trying to control what goes in there, what happens there. So just as in the case of any activity on the surface of the earth, you require military protection for a nation to grow. Similarly, you need to protect your assets in space, because everything of daily life on ground is through space medium of space. And hence, that's where protection of assets comes in. And when protection comes in, obviously the conflict starts, and then it may reach a stage, and it will reach a stage of sort of trying to attack. You have a treaty that we play between weaponization of space and militarization of space. So while militarization has happened because you operate through the medium of space, weaponization has not happened as such, they say so. But then with the use of directed energy weapons, which can be reflected off space assets, you need not actually place a weapon in space. You can actually operate things, disable satellites, cause confusion sitting on ground. So the point at issue is that our daily life on terra firma on the earth is now dependent on space like never before. And if we, India or any other country or the United States, doesn't protect its assets, then it's asking for trouble. And that is where a lot of money is being pumped in, and that is why the Americans have taken this step of Space Force. The Russians are not far behind. They may not call it that way. And the same thing is happening with the Chinese.
Okay.
And it is high time that we in India realize this. Our assets our capability is limited. Our assets are also few. And that actually raises the stakes because our assets are few. We don't have redundancy.
Okay, we'll bring to we'll come back to the India angle of this entire issue a little later. But to continue with the entire issue of militarization of the space and then weaponization of the space, let me bring in Mr. Pant here. Mr. Pant, this entire issue, beginning with the announcement of a new space force by President Trump, has led to this debate of how soon will this militarization of space move to the weaponization of space, something which is now prohibited under the 1967 treaty, and which as of now, as Air Vice Marshal was also pointing out, that looks like that all parties are adhering to.
Well, it's very difficult to ascertain whether the treaty is being interpreted in the way it was designed in '67. If you go back in history, then even the Kennedy administration was having a debate with itself whether or not how can you best interpret it given your national security imperatives. And many in America at that point in time were saying, no, we should go ahead and have some kind of weaponization. And they then played on this word that, look, perhaps defensive weapons won't be something that would be problematic. So how do you define weaponization is also very interesting. I think militarization to some extent has already happened. I don't think we are we need any formal confirmation on that count. If you look at how the Chinese famous ASAT test that they did was basically telling the world that, look, we have arrived as a power that is capable of ultimately militarizing the outer space. And so the question therefore has been that whether countries who are not who are outside this frame right now, accept it or not, creeping militarization has been happening, and countries have been very cleverly wielding both the civilian and the military aspects together, because ultimately, as I think was earlier pointed out, the two are related. The two are intrinsically related. If you want your economy to sustain itself over the assets that are placed in the outer space, then you need some sort of protection for your assets. And how would you protect them? Whether then you can play on this war of defensive versus offensive weapons. I think that ultimately leads to this question about militarization almost redundant. Now what we are looking at is whether, given the frame of reference of the '67 treaty, what the other major spacefaring countries are going to do. Now, I think it is going to be a challenge for if a full-fledged space force is constituted by the Americans. And again, it's not entirely evident to me that that's going to happen, given complications this argument has faced in the Congress, in the US Congress in the past, and also in the wider strategic community. If it at all happens, and I think you are going to look at how the Americans go ahead and implement it, because ultimately on that will depend whether your debate about militarization or weaponization goes ahead or not, and how then your other countries are going to react, because ultimately it is going to be about this definition of weaponization or not. But militarization is happening every single day. We are militarizing space.
Okay, but if you look at the other angle, and I'd like to bring in Mr. Sharma here, what Mr. Pant is pointing out, and does it look like that this push from President Trump of going ahead and putting in place a separate space force, a separate branch to look into the space activities or the military activities in space? Because Chinese have not been very coy or very shy about their aim as far as the space technology is concerned. The Russians have also not been been mincing their words when they talk about being the world #1, and in fact they were the first one who put a satellite in space. So is this already at the race? Is this already has come to that same level as it was maybe way back in 80s?
Well, let's be very clear. There are certain 4 or 5 strengths which we should not mix. One is civilian application of space far outweighs what is possible in military use. That's one thing, because it suffuses the entire economy, global economy and national economies, and the amount of money involved is much larger. Number 2, as has been said, militarization of space has been progressing all through these past decades. However, placement of weapons in space, there is still a bit of coyness about it. Even about the space-based missile defenses, they are still not in position. And the Americans have been advised. Third is that the powers who are now playing in space, China has entered in a big way, but otherwise Russia and the US were already there. Now, between them, there are areas of, as it's very bland and cliche-ridden, cooperation and competition. Because of strategic forces involved, they would like to remove any doubts or any uncertainties which might which might have unintended consequences or inadvertent escalation. So they need to talk to each other, they need to work together. So that process also goes through. Fourth is, for civilian case, the 67 treaty, to follow up on that treaty, there is a UN committee on outer space, peaceful use of outer space. That committee in its own way has been doing work, even things like situational awareness, space situational awareness, which is actually awareness of what is there. There are 23,000 or 43,000 debris, space objects, of which smaller ones nobody can track, bigger ones only Americans can track. So on this also there is a subcommittee, technical committee of the UN space, what you call CAPUS, the Committee of Peaceful Use of Outer Space in UN. That has been working. So, and lastly, apart from creating a space command, President Trump has also issued a policy directive, which is again very exhaustive, telling how to control traffic, how to do space traffic management. Because the whole process of space is something like what it was in 16th century, 17th century in the maritime domain. And who framed the rules? Britain was the most eminent power. So they framed the rules for maritime domain and the naval things. Today in space domain also, spacefaring nations are taught by the US, as has been said. They are far better, far ahead in technology. Like for instance, I mentioned the Chinese were not able to track their own thing for quite some time, but the US was able to track their falling spaceship, their space station. So US is ahead, and they are developing this capability. There is also this other aspect about what President Trump has said, that there are certain technologies which they want to keep to themselves, because they fear that, again, this is the old game, that Russia and China might actually get hold of these technologies. So we are, in a sense, it is deja vu in terms of technology and trying to have control. it is deja vu also in terms of imperative for cooperation and better understanding, because lest things go out of hand.
Okay.
And so in that sense, a US Space Command need not raise these excessive fears, just as their Strategic Forces Command didn't make any fears, because they have been in existence.
Okay.
So we should see it in that overall perspective. It has been overdue.
In the overall context, and while you know the bigger powers are might be busy outdoing each other, let's bring this entire issue a little closer home. And on the Indian perspective, what you are saying, if you could elaborate it a bit further, as to what exactly is in it for you know is in for India here, and how should India be moving ahead given the limited resources and capabilities we have? What should we be aiming at?
Our space program has been civilian led, unlike the Chinese, which is military led actually. So till now, as on date, it is civilian led, and rightly so, because of the resources, the amount of resources we have. We have only one dedicated naval satellite, the GSAT-7. The GSAT-6A didn't work. We lost contact with that. The next one is yet to come up. So the point is, our intermeshing of military programs and civilian programs is gathering pace, but not at the rate at which it should, considering the way India is placed, considering the way our security assets are. Also the fact that everything is now technology driven. All armament, communication, missiles, they're all technology driven, and they are space dependent. So the earlier we get more assets for the military, we cannot have our own launches. For example, the United States Air Force launches its own satellites. It has got launching stations. We don't have the capability. We have only Sriharikota, the single launch station. So the point at issue is that within this framework that we have, first of all, I think if the government can afford it, more money should go out towards a space program with some more emphasis on military specific programs, and we need to share the assets that are available with us and make full optimum use of it.
Okay.
For a greater extent of time, quite some time, we will have to depend on others. For example, the Space Situation Awareness Network, which is an American system, which tracks all the debris in the world. Everybody depends on that. The Russians have a smaller one, Chinese have, but everybody depends on them to find out where are the debris, at what time do we launch, at what time do we take avoidance action because some debris is coming to an already existing satellite. So dependence would continue, but we must get more money into military operations as much as we can operate.
Okay, so lot more resources are required as far as military aspect of is concerned. Mr. Pant, if you look at the civilian side of our space programs, then quite robust, quite a huge potential given the way the ISRO has moved ahead. But would you agree with what Air Vice Marshal Manmohan Bahadur is pointing out, that we need to push the military side of it now?
Yes, we have to look at it more holistically, because if the two are enmeshed, it doesn't make sense for us to singularly focus on what the civilian aspect of our relationship with the outer space is going to be. Because as we have been discussing today, it's being militarized, it's getting militarized, major powers are entering the fray, and I think the conversation in India still tends to be about that 67 treaty. Now, while we need to be aware of its, it has given us something, it has allowed the world to progress in a manner where at least the countries were talking and cooperating, but we should keep our powder dry. We should be ready for an eventuality where major powers would be operating with any lack of inhibition. So ultimately, the next wars are going to be fought with greater reliance on the space than we ever seen in the past. So therefore, we have to be prepared on what is going to be the next frontier, and therefore bringing the two together, civilian and the military side, actually helps not only in terms of our giving greater credibility to the civilian side, but also protecting our core vital national security interests, which is, I think, going to be fundamental as we move forward.
Okay, final comments from you, Mr. Sharma, with respect to the Indian aspect of this entire debate. Would you agree with what both our panelists are saying, that we need to have some cohesiveness in our approach towards, giving that impetus to the use of technology in the outer space?
Yes, our first priority and the second priority and third priority is technology. We must acquire technology which is needed and which is the technology of future. For instance, GPS, we should have our own GPS system. for instance, the situational awareness satellites, infrared satellites in the geostationary orbits, we should have them. We should, if do not have it, then plan. Actually, ISRO has been quite good. I mean, our Mangalyaan and the moon missions, they showed the extent of our ability to observe and surveil the far-flung objects. So we have abilities. We have to build upon them and multiply them, and we have to do it very fast because time is not on our side. Things are moving really at a very accelerated pace in technology. So technology is the way for us to accomplish our interest. If we do not do this and just empty talk, it will not get us anywhere. Technology is our requirement, and ISRO is doing it, and that separation between ISRO and military users. Now that we are out of that old vice grip in which they used to tell us that ISRO should be separate and missile program should be separate, that vice grip is loosened today. So, and technology also is dual use, very, very extensively dual use. So we should not have hesitations.
So there should be no hesitations. Clearly, it looks like, as our panelists have pointed out, that space is the new frontier, and while the major powers in the world are busy racing out each other to try and have the dominance in the space, India should also be focused on building on its capabilities and abilities and try to have a cohesive movement in trying to put the technology to good use as far as outer space is concerned. We'll come back again next week with a different set of guests and a different topic. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.